Welcome, everyone, to the Ourtwocents Podcast. My name is Admir. I'm joined today by Fahad and Osama. Gents, welcome to the show. I don't know why I keep doing this. Y'all are always here, but yeah, all right.
This guy's been welcoming me for a year and a half now. Bro, am I here yet?
Man.
Am I here?
How are y'all doing?
Anyway, thank you for having me, Admir. I appreciated it.
Yes, yeah, same. And I appreciate this routine that you do. I tried to come at the throne today, and I realized, like, the throne is heavy. There's 1,000 swords that were melted
Heavy
to
is the
create
head.
this
Yeah,
throne.
heavy's the head, bro.
And Admir's head is heavy.
Yeah, it
Heavy.
was big when I was a little kid. It was like disproportionately larger to the rest of me, but thankfully I grew it out. Anyway, welcome to the show, everybody. Today we're going international once more. We're going to review Baahubali: The Beginning. We were inspired by two things. Number one, just how much of a good time we had watching and reviewing RRR, which we did a couple weeks ago. So make sure to check that review on our channel. And then secondly, the absolutely huge outpour of just love and appreciation from fans of RRR. And I guess Tollywood on the whole. It was really nice to see everybody come out, show their appreciation for us reviewing that film. And then, of course, all the wonderful suggestions and recommendations that we got. We take that stuff very, very seriously on the show. We're going to try to hit as many of those as possible while still trying to juggle our regular schedule of movies that we had planned for the year. We're going to do our best. We're going to do our absolute best to try to hit on everything. And we're gonna start that today with Baahubali: The Beginning, which of course will mean that down the line in a couple weeks probably we'll review the conclusion. Right? That's the moniker of the second title. But before we get to talking about the movie and before we give our 2 cents, of course, segments, as a heads up, we're gonna talk about how Raju. Oh, I got his name right. Hold on. Rajamouli. Yeah, how he approaches fantasy films and fantasy epics. And we'll talk a little bit about how we feel. Yeah, I said it wrong, man. Damn it. What is it with the snickering?
Bro,
Crazy.
good. Bro, I'm muted.
Bro, it's
Goodness me,
crazy.
I'm muted, dog. I'm muted for this video. Bro, you're trying. I truly appreciate the fact
This
that
is-
Listen, I'm just glad that my
the day-
boss is cultural, man. That's it. That's
Yeah.
all
I
I care.
feel-
I think there will be if not a zero, a very low percentage of people who ding you points for it. The fact that you're trying already makes you better than
appreciate
most
it.
of
I
the
appreciate
world.
it.
You're going out of your way to at least,
I
like,
appreciate
say
it, but I
things,
do feel like LeBron James and y'all are on first take. That's just what it is. Part of me feels like it. But anyway, we're going to review. We're going to talk about the way he approaches his fantasy epics. The second thing we're going to talk about is the storytelling and pace of the film. And then thirdly, talk about the ending, as more specifically the cliffhanger. Is of course spoilers. Movie's been out for about seven years or so. So you can go ahead and watch it on Netflix and come back to this review if needed. Before we do that, housekeeping. 2 things. First thing, our draft standings got an unnecessary update, but I'm gonna chat shit. So Thor: Love and Thunder released over the weekend. We reviewed it. The review is up on the channel. You can go ahead and watch that. I'm in first. With 322 points with the release of Thor. Fahad's in second with 188 points, and Osama's in third with 155 points. We're about halfway on our draft picks for the year. We got about half the year left. We'll see how everything will shake out. The second thing we're going to talk about today, of course, is Osama's comment corner. So, and take it away, Osama.
Yes, thank you, Admir. So, as Admir said, we had an outstanding review of our review of RRR in the comments, in the show out, in the views, in the likes on the video. It truly was humbling for all of us. I mentioned it on our Thor review that we dropped a few days ago. So if you haven't checked that out, please make sure to do so. But we were sincerely elated with the reaction that we got to that video. I'm just going to rattle off a few things. This is a small channel, right? We've been on YouTube for like a year now. Not really pushing this, been trying to grow it, etc. But we did not expect any kind of reaction like this to the movie, especially because of the fact that it's come out for a couple of months and it's racked a little over 10K views already, which is first, ridiculous for all of us to see. It's only been out for 5 days. Secondly, it's amazing because it means that there's a lot more of you that could subscribe to this channel. And so if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, make sure to go down, hit that red button that's right down there that says subscribe. Turn it gray on YouTube. Exactly where you left, a comment on this video. Just make sure, just move your cursor just slightly up, or your thumb, or whatever you're using, and just make that red button gray. Okay, just hit subscribe there. Hit the bell to get notifications on when we drop videos while you're there too, because we do drop videos weekly, the full episodes, as well as the interspersed clips throughout the week. But having said all that, there were 2 comments among the, I believe, around 150 comments on that video that we wanted to highlight, because of course we can't go through all of them. But as we do every week on this podcast show, we do want to highlight at least a comment that was entertaining or interesting or intriguing for us, or even critical of us. And so for this week's episode, I wanted to highlight 2 comments, one that was critical of our review, rightfully so, and one that was very positive about it. Starting with the critical one, a user mentioned, actually, the political party that you're talking about, the BJP, has nothing to do with this movie, because both the states this film industry belongs to, Telangana, is ruled by the rivals of BJP. It is highly unlikely for Rajamouli to make this big of a film just to appease BJP. This would directly harm his future prospects, because he would be going against the ruling political parties of both the states. India is a highly federal. State governments have a lot more power at the local level than the federal government. Rajamouli just loves Indian mythology and loves making larger-than-life movies based on those stories. He's actually a self-proclaimed atheist. Source, Wikipedia, and one of his interviews. I think you're reading a bit too much into this. Again, thank you for that comment. It was very interesting for us to see, because we did mention a little of the political affiliations behind the movie, and so we always appreciate you guys jumping into the comments and letting us know what's actually correct. Another one I wanted to highlight was a person that said, amazing analysis. I liked the 2 cents breakdown concept. It's innovative and interesting. Keep up the good work. To Fahad's comment on linking current nationalist regime in India and PRR, here's my take. Your comments are correct from a North Indian POV, but remember RRR is from Southern India, which is so different in many ways. In South India, particularly in Telugu cinema, integrating mythology and nationalism has been always there since ages. But Bollywood, which is predominantly North India, has always shied away from being rooted to mythology and nation. It is since Baahubali and advent of OTT that North Indian audiences got the taste of their own cultural aspects from Southern cinema, which they were deprived of forever. So since the last 4 or 5 years, as Fahad said, Northern India is totally crazy over Southern cinema and rejecting Bollywood. So right now in India, there's a tectonic shift of pop culture that's happening. So again, Fahad, I know mentioned in both comments, you are a star in the comment section of the RRR review. But again, appreciate everybody who dropped a comment in that video. If you haven't and you want to check out the review, go check it out and leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought. We're still having ones roll in right now, and we hope to hear more of you who actually recommended us to watch Baahubali 1 and 2, which is why we're out here, as Admir mentioned, reviewing this video. So please make sure to show out down below.
Fahad's our Joe Rogan, man. He's our Joe Rogan. He's just the lightning.
I mean, for views.
Yeah, you're the view getter.
Baby.
Yeah, you get the views, man. We're actually gonna go to Fahad. He's gonna give us a rundown of the plot.
Just so dudes can cook me for saying the names wrong. That's just
absolutely. I already got cooked on the one name, so you can go ahead and get cooked on the rest of the names.
Oh,
but take it away, my brother.
Okay, so this is the plot for Baahubali 1. It's a pretty long plot, so bear with me, just like the movie. Near the ancient kingdom of Mahishmati, an injured woman named Shivgami exits a cave underneath a mountain waterfall carrying an infant. She kills 2 soldiers pursuing her and attempts to cross a raging river, but slips and is washed away in the current. Before drowning, she holds the baby aloft and prays to Lord Shiv, explaining that she doesn't care about her life and wishes that the baby, Mahendra Baahubali, must live. The child is saved by the people of the local Amburi tribe who reside near the river and worship Lord Shiv. The wife of the tribe's chieftain, Sangha, decides to adopt the boy and names him Shivdu. Shivdu grows up to be an ambitious and mischievous child obsessed with ascending the mountain. Despite Sangha's pleas, he tries many times to scale the cliffs but always fails. As a young man, he is shown to possess superhuman strength when he lifts a lingam of Lord Shiv and places it at the foot of the mountain. A mask then falls from the cliffs, and realizing it possesses feminine features, Shivdu finally succeeds in scaling the mountain in order to find the woman the mask belongs to. Upon reaching the top, he sees a beautiful woman named Avantika fighting Mahishmati soldiers. He discovers that she's a member of a local resistance group dedicated to overthrowing the tyrannical king of Mahishmati, Lord Bhalaldev, and rescuing royal captive Princess Devsena. Shivdu is immediately smitten with Avantika and secretly follows her, even managing to draw a tattoo on her hand while she sleeps. When she discovers Shivdu she attacks him, but he outmaneuvers her and returns her mask. Realizing he scaled the entire mountain to find her, she reciprocates his feelings. Ooh, I need to climb some mountains, man. The pair are later attacked by more soldiers, and after defeating them, Shivdu pledges to rescue Devsena himself and departs for Mahishmati. He secretly enters the city on Bhalaldev's birthday and assists in erecting a gigantic statue of the king. In the process, he's recognized by a worker who then leads the other workers in chanting Baahubali to Shivdu's confusion and Bhalaldev's pleasure. What's going on? What's going on?
Nothing, bro. You're good. Keep going.
Wow. That's
We gotta get through this plot, man. We gotta get through this plot.
This is crazy long.
The people want the review, Fahad. Come on.
Yeah. Who then leads the other workers in chanting Baahubali to Shivdu's confusion and Bhalaldev's displeasure. Shivdu later infiltrates the royal palace disguised as a soldier and distracts Bhalaldev and his guards long enough for him to rescue Devsena. Bhalaldev sends his son Bhadra and the royal family's loyal slave Katappa to recapture Devsena. In the ensuing fight, why are you smiling? Wow. Shivdu beheads Bhadra as both the Amburi tribe and resistance warriors arrive. Katappa lunges at Shivdu but stops short of attacking him upon seeing his face. He falls into submission at Shivdu's feet, proclaiming him to be Baahubali. The next morning, Katappa reveals to Shivdu that he is actually Mahendra Baahubali, the son of Amarendra Baahubali, a famous warrior prince from Mahishmati. Amarendra Baahubali was born an orphan. His father, King Vikram Deva, died before he was born, and his mother died giving birth to him. Lord Bijal Dev, Vikram Dev's brother, and the next in line for the throne, is denied the position due to his scheming nature. And such that Bijal Dev's wife, Lady Shivgami, assumes power with the intention of raising both her son Bhalal Dev and the orphan Baahubali in an equal manner to select the next heir to the throne. While the two are raised as brothers and trained rigorously in numerous subjects, Bhalal Dev retains the power-hungry nature of his father, while the affable Baahubali becomes beloved by the kingdom. A traitor named Saketudu turns out to be a spy for the savage Kalakea tribe, known as Destroyers of Kingdoms. Their chief, Inkoshi, declares war on Mahishmati, and Shivgami decides that whoever kills Inkoshi will be crowned king. Bijal Dev secretly supplies Bhalal Dev with more weapons and men, but Baahubali still defeats more raiders than Bhalal Dev by using innovative tactics and by inspiring his soldiers. While Bhalal Dev kills Inkoshi, Bahubali's valor and concern for the people of his kingdom convinces Shivgami to make Baahubali heir apparent. Oh my goodness. I slaughtered these names. In the present day, Shivdu's adoptive parents, impressed by Katappa's story, wish to meet Baahubali. A dejected Katappa explains that Amarendra Baahubali is dead, and upon being questioned by Shivdu, he reveals that the traitor who murdered Baahubali was none other than him, setting a path for a sequel. Dun dun dun. That's crazy.
Well done, Fahad.
Many an obstacle in the way of you reading that plot, and I think you did a stellar job.
If you're wondering why I was dying laughing, it's because you're pronouncing everything relatively fine, but you got tripped up with the word gigantic. That's just the only reason I was dying laughing.
Bro, there's like some crazy and I probably said a couple of the names wrong too. Like I'm just like.
No, you're fine.
Lots of tongue twisters in there. I'm gonna say that we're a complicated people.
These plots,
the names tend to be crazy long. Admir, I can do the actor names too if you want me to.
Go for it, please.
So, so the film is directed by S.S. Rajamouli, same as RRR. Baahubali is played by Prabhas. Devsena is played by Anushka Shetty. Avantika is played by Tamanna. Bhalal Dev is played by Rana Dagubati. Bhadra, this dude's son, is played by Advi Sesh. Shivgami is Ramya Krishnan. Nasser M is M. I didn't see his last name. He's Bijaldev. He's the brother. Then I think we're good so far, right? Did I miss anybody big yet?
No, I think that's it.
Katappa. Yeah, Satyaraj.
Yeah.
Satyaraj is Katappa. He's actually pretty. Yeah, that's a big character to miss. But yes, that's the kind of cast of the film and the plot. Thank you guys for giving me the opportunity, obviously, to be able to do that.
Wonderful.
I'll make sure to write about it in your 360 review, man.
Anderson Booper, crazy, bro. That's nuts.
The only other thing I want to mention is just the box office performance of the movie. So it was released back in July 2015, July 10th actually. So we're kind of on the heels of its 7th anniversary. Budget of about 28 million. Yeah, and it grossed 93 to 100 million. I'm using dollars here just for our viewers to keep in mind. So it did about 4x. Which is quite a good return.
Which is bonkers.
I think this is a top 3 all-time Indian film in terms of box office, I believe.
I think the second one is number 1. Yeah, I think it's 1, 2, unless... I know that the second one is up there, and then it's KGF 2, and then it's this one. Yeah. So it's a combination of those 3.
Or it could be top 5. Yeah, I don't want to misspeak, but it is one of the more successful blockbusters back in the day. But yeah, that leads us very kindly, again, thanks for that. Leads us kindly into the 2 cent segment, where I will say a statement and have the boys here either give it a 1 cent, meaning they disagree with it, or they think not too highly of it, or 2 cents, meaning that they loved it. Try not to have any middle ground here. So really the first question is, the question is sort of, what do you make of Rajamouli's approach to fantasy epics, right? Are we 1 cent on his approach? Is this grand scale, larger than life approach, great? Or do we think that it's maybe too much and a little bit over the top? So I'll go to Fahad for this first.
I feel like when we think of kind of Indian films or like things coming out of Asia, because of how recently colonialism happened, that's kind of the lens that we watch it through. That's kind of like the movies, like a lot of the movies that like get popularity here is kind of like drawing some sort of story related to that or completely unrelated story, where this is probably civilization wise one of the first civilizations like ever, right? Because of the valley and shit, right? But in terms of kind of them having a very complex story that's not really related to this 200 or 300 year view that we have. There's like a 3,000 year stories, right? So the fact that he's kind of taking that on in India at the scale that he's taking it on, especially like if you go by like some of our comments, a lot of people mentioned that no one tried to take it on at this scale to talk about these stories, and now this has almost caused like a cultural shift where although these movies might have existed prior, he has kind of somehow managed to bring it into the mainstream to give it like a massive spotlight. And that's all to say, it's 2 cents for me. I do think there's some kind of, you can see, I was talking to Admir about this before we started, you can see in RRR in ways that he has improved from a storytelling perspective, from building a fantasy story perspective. From Baahubali, you can see in the 7 years how much he has come as a director. That's not to say that Baahubali is necessarily like a much worse movie or a bad movie, but you can see just little things that he's getting right as compared to the initial 2015 movie. So it's definitely not a faultless way to kind of go about it, but I do applaud his courage and kind of bravery in terms of taking on such a big project, and obviously it being a hit. And we also didn't mention yet that this movie, both parts of this movie, was made in one kind of, not one take, but it was made as one movie. Then they just chopped it up at a part where it was appropriate to have a second movie, because dudes were just like, 5-hour movie, no one's gonna watch that, you need to like cut it. So they almost did it in like, for the lack of like a better comparison, I think Sam mentioned, like Lord of the Rings, where you just make it and then they come out back to back, right? So the fact that he was able to take on like a kind of such a big kind of project and still come out on top, I'm definitely high on that. And I'm generally high on fantasy epics, but I do think that you guys can contest me on this. I don't think we haven't had like any like great fantasy epic from like that's kind of that's like Western based in at least in the last decade. I would say. I don't know if Avatar would count. But
I mean that's based in like a true source.
Yeah,
story.
like some level of realism. Like I'm willing to consider Greek mythology stories in this too. Like any sort of kind of like godly situation going on, and then a hero's journey type movie. I don't know if we have gotten a lot of like kind of.
We haven't got the movie,
one.
but like I would say Game of Thrones is the only thing that probably
Game
comes
of Thrones,
to mind.
and even then Game of Thrones is like, is it really the story of like one dude from like going from like bottom to this is like these movies are built in such a kind of like you could almost call them linear to an extent, but it's not a bad linear. It's a good linear where you kind of know the progressions that the story is taking, and it's not trying to be like funny or ironic when it's not supposed to be. You know,
these are based on recent fictional books too, and I think to your point, Fahad, it's rare that we get one, and of course because of just how young America is and just the lack of like a super deep rooted like 1,000-year-old culture here, but we don't get those original like folkloric or mythological stories much here. Like the most recent one. I know we were talking about a little bit about this off camera, but 300 is one that comes to mind. Relatively recent, but we could talk about the merits of like where you put that up in the grand scheme of films. But it does feel like the genre is something that we rarely get over here in America. We get it definitely based on like fiction sources for sure. Like Dune obviously came out last year or the year before. I'm losing track of time now, but last year. I'm not sure what the last one was that was based on a source.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I'm just like Admin, you're gonna say something.
No, I do feel like this grand blockbuster sort of approach to like mythology films. So like the Greek and I think Roman mythology has been mined quite a bit by Hollywood.
Insane amount.
So so the reaction that I think you'll get from audiences is quite apathetic.
Exactly.
However, you do have you have the Vikings TV show, for example, or you have like God of War leaning into Norse mythology. So you do have Marvel does it a little bit as well in sort of their cinematic universe.
Yeah.
So there are Western mythologies that haven't been sort of mined as much as sort of the Greek and the Roman. And I think we mentioned it at the top that this is relatively new in Indian cinema, right? Where you have this sort of blockbuster approach to the mythology that has been in their culture for so long. So they're sort of starting to explore that, and you have to ask sort of, does Hollywood have the same incentive to explore mythology in the same way? I think if let's say you give the resources of Hollywood to a Norway or to a Scandinavian country, they might do something with Norse mythology. But a lot of the mythology films that we get are through an American lens of that mythology, right?
It's funny,
very rare.
Speaking of that, like Northmen could fall under this actually.
So we got a relatively smaller one.
So that would be something like that. But Northmen is, you don't have like thousands of dudes fighting thousands of dudes, you know?
Right.
Like
the scale isn't
exactly
there as with this one.
I'll pass it on right now. Like saying all that to say, it's like such like one of the oldest civilizations in the world that has like thousands of complex stories. There's a large space for this. So if they keep expanding, they could we were talking about, I was kind of sent a screenshot of the movie that's coming out later this year on September, Brahmastra. So that will build on another kind of universe too. So this movie has probably laid down the foundations for that, and I think all these other kind of creatives have Rajamouli to thank for it. Yeah, Sam, I'll pass it on to you. My bad.
Yeah, no. I mean, you're good, man. I'm just gonna again another point in your 360 review that I'll have to just make. Interrupts. Not that I don't. But yeah, I just want to make a few clarifications. So when we talk about the scale of the films, of course, we have to understand that India, specifically Bollywood, for the longest time has been the second largest film industry in the world, if not the largest, especially now considering the wide reach of the international releases. I know they definitely produce and deliver more films per year than Hollywood for sure. But when we're talking about like the reception in terms of box office dollars, I'm sure Hollywood edges that out. But we should acknowledge that this is a big film industry, and I think the genre of these epics and even these stories have existed for a while, but the distinction here is that the scale of which they're being created is recently getting larger and larger, as we saw with RRR, right? And I think I read somewhere that Rajamouli's passion for these stories started when he was a kid reading comics on these different characters, Baahubali, Rama, Mahabharata, etc., like these old Indian stories that even dating back to like Sanskrit stories that then get adapted decade and decade again, but taking a little bit of a twist on it, making them a little bit more modern. I think maybe I'm remembering this, but I think this film is set in the 8th century, which is not too long ago, and of course that's pretty loose with the storytelling, etc., how modern versus how old it is. But it is, I to the original point about the mythological epic stories, if you asked me this question a few months ago, maybe a year ago, I would probably say that I'm really down on fantasy epics as a whole. I'm not someone who's typically, and I think Admir, we maybe have had this conversation on the podcast before, where you and I typically don't tend to get drawn towards the fantasy style genre. Right. Whereas Fahad, I know it's a big lure for you. And so coming into even RRR, I saw the reception, and I know just from the comments that were left in that video, as well as just what I've seen online, that Baahubali is a big movie as well. I know it. I going in, I probably knew it was going to be a good film, but I never know exactly what I'm expecting. And for me, I like building worlds and building stories that are still kind of grounded in what is true and what is real that we know around us today. And so it's always scary for me to think about, even when we watch Marvel films, like the extent at which they can get to and the ridiculousness that can come out of these films. And so I think when I watched this film, Baahubali, I think the first half slightly suffered from the extent of the out of the box nature of the film. The fantasy perspective really didn't lend itself too well to the intro, I don't think, because I didn't feel grounded in any kind of story until maybe halfway through the film. And knowing that this was part of a much larger film that was, of course, split into the beginning and the conclusion, it makes a little bit of sense when it comes to the pacing. We talked about this even with the first Lord of the Rings film, so I think they both suffer from the same kind of pacing issues, where the first half of the film I didn't really understand what was going on because of the fantasy epic nature to it. But now that I'm thinking back on this question over the past few weeks, having watched RRR, having watched Baahubali, I'm really, especially with the films that we saw this year as well, The Northman, like you mentioned, Fahad, last year with Dune, etc. I'm higher and higher on fantasy epics as a whole, especially ones that are based in some form of literature or old storytelling, because you kind of see a lot of that grandeur being displayed in the films themselves. And so when you have a director like this with a long leash and the ability to continuously make the biggest blockbusters in India, it's really exciting to see those stories come to life in a way that's visually breathtaking, in a way that actually puts you at the edge of your seat where you go, actually, that's insane. I'm not even that big of an pure action fan, but watching this film throughout, I'm like, wow, I'm really being put in that setting. I'm really being put in the environment where I can envision these things that are larger than life. Because you read this in a textbook, you read this in a book, in a fiction book, etc. It feels really abstract. But then when it comes to life on the big screen, I really enjoyed it. And I'm someone who's grown up, kind of having a slight aversion to Star Wars, having a slight aversion to initially Lord of the Rings at first, and we know I've come around on that. So for me, I think this has been a big part of that over the past few weeks. So it's a 2 cents for me on the genre of fantasy epics, and I'm really looking forward to breaking down the rest of his films for that reason. What about you, Admir?
Yeah, I'm echoing a lot of what you guys have said. So first thing I want to say, so I remember when me and Fahad first met each other, I remember his distinct love of 300, and I didn't quite get it. I remember watching the movie also, and I thought it was like fun. It was, it was a good time. I didn't love it. He really loved the movie, and I remember not getting it, but watching these movies, which he's been exposed to far longer than I have, you see how much 300 either, I don't know, was inspired, did inspire, whichever direction it is, but it's very closely tied. Like I look at that movie now way closer to being associated with like Eastern blockbusters than I do with like Western blockbusters, because of the way it was shot, some of the more dramatic moments, some of the more upscale battles that are happening throughout. So just some trivia for folks out there about a young Fahad. But
That's crazy. That's crazy.
On that, just
I've actually watched that movie like 7 times.
yeah,
bro.
I know. Like
I watched
you're a
it
huge
dubbed
fan
in
of it.
Bengali. Like I've watched it dubbed in Bangla like back in the day. So I love that movie.
Yeah.
On that note, Admir, I know we talked about this one specific sequence in 300 a few episodes ago where it was shot with 2 simultaneous cameras, allowing, again, who's the protagonist in 300 again?
Leonidas and Gerard
seen
Butler.
Allowing
Whichever one you prefer.
Leonidas in his singular motion fighting through crowds for us to get like a crystal clear zoom in, zoom out, etc. And watching Baahubali last night, there was an exact replica of that shot, and I thought, wow, that was actually really well done. And we talked about it on that episode, so make sure to check it out. I don't even remember which episode that was, but so make sure to check all of them out, I guess, is what I'm saying. But it came yesterday in the movie, and I was like, well, that's really well done. It's a very technically difficult shot to make. And I thought just a lot of those action sequences, of course, I will get to later on, were super emblematic of 300, which we forget came out now
a while ago,
18 years ago. That's 2006.
Yeah.
Sorry, 16 years ago. That's
16.
wild.
Yeah. It's been a long time. No, and when you watch these movies, for me, what ends up happening is you get this fuller understanding of cinema, and like 300 no longer is an outlier. Like in my head, it was always an outlier in how Zack Snyder made the film and where it sits in other action movies, and again, in my head. But watching these other films from Rajamouli, it's not that big of an outlier. It's more sort of, in line with these approaches. But the thing I wanted to say with sort of fantasy epics on the whole, me personally, I'm always down for a long movie. I typically have a long leash for films that are 3+ hours. I don't mind them, I think, as much. So I'm typically okay with that. Funnily enough, though, as you mentioned, Osama, they never have been the fantasy types. For me, the aversion was always the fact that I'm going into this and there's going to be a lot thrown at me, and I feel like I'm going to have to do a lot of work to keep up with what's happening. And it was a little bit, I overestimated that problem, right? At the end of the day, these films are made for general audiences. They're not made for a niche audience, right? So the directors, if they're good enough, will carve it in such a way where you're not lost in the details. And Rajamouli very much succeeds in that respect. So props to him on that. The other thing I wanted to say is, at the end of the day, films like this are cultural artifacts to some degree. They're not a historical retelling of actual events, of course not. But at this very moment, it is a capturing of culture in 2015. It was it Southern India, right? That Tollywood's based in, right?
Yeah.
So you have this cultural artifact that somebody from me who's never been to India, I'm really not exposed to Indian culture, can watch a movie like this and pick up stuff from it, right? Like, I love Greek mythology and those stories, not just because we learned them in school. It's because I played God of War growing up as a kid. You watch these movies growing up as a kid. You watch these TV shows. You get references consistently across the culture. So it's, to truly understand a mythology and to truly understand these stories, it can't just be, in my opinion, I think, as you mentioned, in textbooks or in just books, right? I think that's a way you get introduced to it, and I think that's a way you can expand your knowledge on these things. But to truly understand the grandeur of these stories, I think film is like the best way to do that, right? It's really the best way to sear these characters and these stories and these moments into your head. Like we said about 300. I haven't watched 300 in the longest time, right? But some of the visuals and some of those fight battles and sequences are in my head, and that's the mythology of the 300 Spartans, right? You're forever ingrained with that story. And so I've come to appreciate fantasy epics, especially those that are grounded in some forms of a retelling of mythology, right? Because they give you this gateway into another culture. And so it's of huge importance that these movies get made, not just for an Indian audience to sort of revere their own stories, but also for the rest of us who are not at all accustomed to these stories or used to them to get this insight into what they are. So
Guys, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it looks like we're getting some news now to the OTC penthouse. It seems Admir's Wi-Fi has unfortunately passed away. Now, due to these unforeseen circumstances, for the remainder of this podcast, we will show a picture in his honor. Back to you guys.
The only drawback I have with fantasy epics in general, and I do feel like Rajamouli's stories suffer from that a little bit, is the lack of moral ambiguity in these stories. We mentioned it a little bit before we started recording, and it typically will reside in something like there's clearly a bad person and then there's clearly a good person, and sort of how will it play out, you sort of know ahead of time, and it's more about the journey than the end, and that's perfectly fine. But I do feel like some of the weight of the movie gets lost in these stories when you know the good person sort of will win out, right? And I think that's also something that's typically steered me away from fantasy films. It was one of the drawbacks I had for Lord of the Rings. Like, as much as I liked The Two Towers, for example, the clear dichotomy of bad and evil reduces sort of any sort of tension I as an audience member might have for trying to pick a side, right? And even in RR, where you do have Beam and Ram positioned as sort of against each other, ultimately their goals are very similar. It's more about the way that they go about it. And then, of course, you know, that they end up being on the same page eventually. So I appreciated the introduction of moral ambiguity in that film. In this one, it's severely lacking. Baahubali is clearly the good, brother in this case, and his son is clearly the right descendant to the throne. And it's more about how do we get there. And so for me, moral ambiguity in film forces characters to do things, and we learn about those characters, and I think we learn about ourselves in that process, and they're a little bit lost in sort of these stories, and that's maybe okay. Not every story needs to be this sort of gray area retelling. It just seems to be a constant in fantasy epics for me, whether it's Lord of the Rings, whether it's Star Wars, MCU a little bit, if you want to call that fantasy, and now sort of what Rajamouli's doing. So I don't know if it's something that plagues just the fantasy genre in general. Game of Thrones tried to get away from that a little bit, and I think they did so successfully, barring the end of that story. But it is something I do feel like is lacking in the genre.
You want to talk about it?
Huh? Yeah, the reviews are up for season 8 of Game of Thrones, so you can go watch us be wrong and be hopeful up until the final episode. So you can go listen to that. Fahad was on many of those. He was many on those reviews. But so I'm still 2 cents
before my time.
I don't listen to those clips ever.
I'm 2 cents on the genre. Yeah, I'm 2 cents on the genre as a whole. I was engaged with Baahubali a lot more than RRR because of that base and sort of this 8th century sort of setup, right? And that very nicely leans into the second thing we're going to talk about, which is the storytelling and pace of the film. And I can go ahead, I guess, since I just brought it up. But Osama, you mentioned that you didn't like the fantasy beginning to the story, that you thought it was a little bit probably disjointed maybe from the second half of the movie. For me, there's like a distinct first third, second third, and final third to the film, right? I, weirdly enough, love the first third of the movie because it sets up like this very, hey, this is a myth story expectation to the film, which I thought was missing from RRR, and that sort of played into my issue of sort of the action in that movie, right? In this one, it starts out like he's doing something that's already pretty impossible, which is, to climb this huge mountain. And I enjoyed that. Almost, it reminded me of like when Simba grows up, you get that sequence of like him doing the same action. He's just growing up as he's doing it, which is super cute. And I was down for that. I'm like,
that's really cool that you made that analogy, because a rumor was that apparently Rajamouli, when trying to convince Prabhas to do the movie, he was like, "You're gonna be Simba. This is gonna be Lion King, and you're gonna be Simba and Mufasa, like in this movie." And he was like, "Oh snap, okay."
He's technically, he plays his own father, right? And I love that sort of setup where it's like, hey, they're already bringing in this the god Shiv into the story. You have this monumental task that's almost, only a god could do it, and then you have the very clear explanation of him being this powerful person and with this hazy background, right? So for me, I personally really enjoyed that start to the story. I do think the pacing is a bit odd in the middle third, because it ramps up so quickly with that flashback that it does question sort of where that middle third sits in this movie. It does, I don't want to say it meanders a bit, but it does go on for quite a while. And then the other thing that Rajamouli does in this movie that I don't know if I've seen of recent times, when he does the flashback, it's the flashback for quite a while. Like, he doesn't disperse the flashback throughout the movie, right? Which is what I think I'm used to a lot of the times. You get these flashbacks, then you come forward, then flashback, then you come forward, right? I personally enjoyed going back and just staying back and then playing that out. I don't know if it fit sort of with where the second third of the movie was in terms of the pacing, but that final third and that just sticking to the flashback, I really loved. And it's clearly the thing that sells the movie, I think, to the masses, and it is an outlandishly amazing achievement considering the $28 million in budget that this movie had. When I initially suggested we talk about that in the sense of how does it compare to Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, Osama, I meant it in that I think it's a crazy achievement that a movie like this can conjure up similar emotions and similar feelings of grandeur with, I don't know, what was Lord of the Rings, 100 million, something like that was the budget. So, a fourth or a third of that budget, right? So for me, the storytelling and the pacing, I love the storytelling. The pacing is a little bit wonky at times, but it is saved very much so, in my opinion, by that just bombastic, amazing third act. I'll go to you, Osama, for this one because I think I went to Vahan first for the other one.
So that's a 2 cents from you, Admir.
Yeah, it's 2 cents. Yeah, absolutely, 2 cents. Yeah.
There were a lot of great points. I think the mention of Lord of the Rings, I think this is even crazier to complete with that kind of a budget. I think they, on top of the war scenes, as you're mentioning, they had, including those and the rest of the film, there was like 90% of this film included some form of CG, and like there was a ton of VFX shots spread across like a dozen different companies or something like that. So for them to complete something like that within a couple of years is mind-blowing, within that budget as well. Something like 2,700 shots, which is like beyond obscene to complete. You also mentioned the fact that I remember when we were talking about RRR, you said it was really jarring for the film to go from like really this baked in realism perspective to switching all of a sudden from Rama becoming this god, like taking on the bow and arrow, and then just like truly evolving into this god character, and how this is the reverse for you in this film. And I think that struck me too watching this movie, because I went in with the expectation that this is going to be like action packed from the get-go. We're going to get like really engaging scenes from the beginning, and I was kind of taken aback by how slow the first third, as you mentioned, was of this film. We got an opening of a bunch of different sequences that don't really tell you what the backstory is, and so I found myself an hour into the movie still not fully understanding what's going on. I see at this point Baahubali or Shivdu, is that his name? In the first third of the movie, he's with his adoptive family, presumably, and growing up, and he's clearly this rebellious kid who's climbing this mountain. Cool, I see that story. And then I see the story of this warrior clan who we don't know who they are yet, separate story also happening simultaneously. There's a lot of different like similarities between the two, because obviously we have the opening sequence of the mom holding the newborn baby fighting off these warriors. I'm not exactly sure who's on whose side anymore. And then we're introduced to this larger kingdom owning a bunch of slaves, very tyrannical, etc. So I'm getting introduced to so many different elements, but not necessarily able to put two and two together quite yet in the first third of the film. And then the pacing is just really slow compared to what I expected going in. And so I think this one failed in terms of the set of expectations, and that was always going to happen coming off of RRR, the biggest and most up-to-date version of what this could possibly be. We're watching this in reverse, of course. And of course, this is the first of two movies. But I think going in, seeing love stories really from the get-go, songs from the get-go, without myself understanding the weight behind them or the reason I should even care about these love stories. I think for me, one of the biggest downfalls I think of the film is the first love song where Shivdu is climbing. He finally climbs this mountain because of this this temptress that he sees in the mountain, kind of engaging him to follow different routes to get to the top of it. I understood that as a concept of his journey to get to the top of the mountain, but I didn't really understand the purpose of this like love moment when we just like went through a bunch of hardship between him and his mom, him and this like apparent hatred for gods in the beginning or something like that, like his just, I guess, like disdain for religion at the time, etc. And so I was really confused about what I should feel. Is this like meant to be a kind of rom-com fun kind of story, or is this meant to be like action-packed and serious? And so each individual thing in isolation was really fun to see, but together it created this kind of boring, slow narrative as we got into the second, third. And as you mentioned, that's when things started to really ramp up all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where second, third, I'm with you. I loved the flashback just consuming the entire film. That's when everything started to make sense for me. That's when things started to become more linear, ironically, as we went back in time, as the story started to unfold. And I'm sure that's part of the direction of this film, is to say, you know, no one really knows who this guy is. He doesn't even know who he himself is.
Right. And
that'll unravel throughout the film. I felt like it just took too long to get there in a way. And we're introducing so many characters that I started to lose track of who's who and who's against who and who's like a good guy and bad guy. There's like the clear protagonist and clear villain, but all these other secondary and tertiary characters, what are they looking for again? Why is this like enslaved mother crying again? Why does she assume her son is going to come back again? How is she the mother if this other woman was carrying the baby in the beginning of the film and she got lost in this river? These kind of stories where I'm like, did I miss something? I'm not sure. And when that happens, I mean, we talked about this before, then there's a cognitive dissonance there. There's a moment where I'm like taken away from the entertainment of the moment itself, and I'm starting to like think back, do I need to rewind? Did I miss something? And no, it showed by the end of the film that was all intentional to get to this place where we can start to build the story back up from the beginning. My only criticism of that is that it probably took too long to get to that point. And so for me, the second and third acts of this film are really what made it shine. We got to the really solid pacing and even better storytelling, which is hard to do. Like when we get to you would think the beginning third of the film, because of its slow nature, would be the really storytelling heavy part of the film where we're getting most of the exposition about the storyline, and to me it was the exact opposite. The last third, where all of the action and war is actually where we're getting the most backstory, the most clear storytelling of how we got to the point that we are right now, the motivations behind each of the characters. We start to see how this really strong woman took on this kingdom and was able to rule it in what seemingly is a just way, and then she had her reasons for choosing Baahubali as the new king to lead this kingdom, and we understand the motivations behind the villain himself and his father, and those things start to clear up at the moment where we're at the most action-packed part of the film. And so for me, if that could have been replicated in the first third, and then having those same stylistic elements interspersed throughout, I would have been much happier. So for me, on the whole, I'm giving it a 2 cents, but the first third of the film is where it felt really lacking for me, and where maybe it was my tiredness, etc. I started to feel slightly bored with where the film was going, and I'm really glad that the second and third acts picked up really well, and got me right back to that place where I was excited to see what's going to happen next in the story. That's over to you, Fahad. What do you think about the pacing?
So yeah, just to note, if you adjust Lord of the Rings 94 million budget for inflation to 2015, it's actually 125 mil. So like
a fourth,
that's 28 mil, 100. That's like 100 million difference between the budgets. But yeah, I feel like I complain a lot about certain stories not giving me enough exposition, and the early portion of this movie almost gives you a lot of exposition. And also, like, to both of your points, I feel like there's a lot of kind of running around without really telling you what's going on or what's what. I do agree with that. Like, there's parts of this movie, and for me, it's some of the placements of the songs that's kind of held back by traditional culture of what movies kind of consist of, right? As compared to him being a trailblazer. Like, I'm guessing he didn't want to trailblaze everywhere on this movie, because if you see the difference in RRR there's no point in the movie where they just randomly have a song with people that
Right.
are not in the movie. Like, I'm personally not a big fan of item songs in like Bollywood or generally like Eastern culture. I'm not a big fan of a dancer being in the movie just dancing just because of the way she looks without her actually being in the movie. Like, it's not even any relationship. Like, she's literally just dancing. Like, when they go to like that Singapore basically, right? Where
Right.
they to hunt the spy, right? And they just have a random like song. In that moment, I'm like, this could cut the kind of tension that you're trying to create
Yeah.
for an audience that not necessarily might be used to like this version of film, right? Like, that could create certain pacing issues. And it's the same thing with like him kind of climbing over and them creating like this kind of almost out of place thing, because soon you're about to see his mother like enslaved for 25 years. Like, that's a very difficult scene for me to like come back into when you're showing this other stuff. But having said all of that, I do think, although that's a little bit extra in certain situations, I think this movie also gives me enough where I can't complain about the fact that it didn't give me enough information, where I might even know too much at this point. Like, you can kind of see this with RR2. This guy seems to be like a big fan of holding cards that he'll just play at random times. That'll be a twist. They'll take you away. Like, the fact that that's his aunt still isn't technically revealed, but once you realize, oh, these are the dads and this woman died, so you got to do the math. The movie doesn't really tell you that outright, so it holds a lot of cards. Basically, we'll eventually talk about the ending, which is him also holding a card. Like, he constantly just seems to be like, okay, I'm about to like shock you again. So while you're trying to do that, if you have pacing issues, it creates like kind of problems, right? In terms of kind of keeping the audience interested. But I was like a massive, like 300 was a very fair point. Like, I was a massive fan of the end sequences of the film, of both him and his cousin. And that's kind of like the funny part too, how although the cousin is supposed to be the villain, Rajamouli is still giving him enough respect to, although like his view is ass, like he's clearly a shitty person, but he still gets like the cool chariot. Like, he still gets like some cool sequences of him also killing dudes, although he might be killing less people or be more like merciless than his the dude that's gonna become king, but he has like a different aspect to it. But it's 2 cents for me, but I do think that's what I kind of mentioned earlier, where you can see little things where he grew. Like, the songs aren't enough of a bad point for me to ding him like a lot on it, but it's still like the stuff needs to fit in the story. Now, if it's like, oh, these are like two undercover police detectives that are going to hunt like a criminal or some shit, and they happen to be at a nightclub, and then someone's dancing in the background, that's different. Here, it just seems like very convenient that this would happen, and two princes who have never been out are all of a sudden like out dancing and doing all sorts of weird shit that we've never seen them do any of that in the rest of the film. But yeah, 2 cents for me, but I do think that you see him improve a lot in the movie that came out in March, which is amazing. I love it when like a director grows over time instead of being stubborn, not naming any names.
And he's been doing this for a while. I think Baahubali was like his 11th or 12th film. And
So the
since then,
fact
he's made
that
quite a few.
And the fact that and even in RRR, like probably his 14th, 15th film, if your best project is your last project and you've been working for like 20 kind of years,
Killing it.
That's massive. And even saying that, I'm sure people will contest like, well, Baahubali 2 has the biggest box office, so you can't say RRR is the best project, but RRR in terms of like international like reception,
It'll get there. It'll also get there.
It's so big, and I'm sure Netflix is a scheming organization. They'll eventually release it in limited release in theaters to make more money off of it, because I'm sure they bought the rights off of it for Western audiences. But yeah.
Speaking of which, I saw the film in Tamil. I didn't get a chance. For some reason, I couldn't find the Telugu version of it. I don't know which versions either of you
I watched
saw,
the Hindi. I watched the Hindi version of it because
Yeah.
I understood the Hindi. That's why it made sense to me. And the thing is, you're right. There's 3 versions of the film on Netflix, and the poster for all 3 of them look the same. You need to click on it and read which language it is. Yeah, because I was just.
I actually think it's like 4 or 5 actually.
Yeah,
it's originally filmed in
Telugu,
both Tamil and Telugu.
Yeah.
No, Tamil. Is it?
Tamil is Telugu. Tamil is Telugu, I think.
and Malayalam.
Yes,
right? Something,
yes.
and then like dubbed maybe in Hindi and another.
Yes,
language.
but with the same, just like with RRR, someone mentioned that in the comments. It's with the same actors. It's not someone else that dubbing did. So the actors technically are speaking 2, 3, 4 languages just to kind of do this. While our boy Vin Diesel collects checks for saying 3 words.
That's another thing you gotta give props for. It's not just like the languages, but they also are dedicated to the physicality of what's required in the films. They're dedicated to the dancing, everything else. So like to be a Bollywood, Tollywood star, you have to be like ridiculously multifaceted, and we like praise dudes like Tom Cruise that are super rare here in America for doing that. But there's gotta be like credit given to these guys in the East who like as a base requirement have to have like 5 different skills.
Exactly. Yeah. No.
That's a good point on the song placements and sort of
because I know that's something that like I would see you thinking that.
Yeah.
But you're gonna give it leash because you're gonna be like, I don't want to be an asshole and like not want to sound like
bleep that. No,
right?
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that
absolutely.
could be crazy if you beep
He's
that
in your head.
It's weirdly enough, I felt like the chaos, if you will, or the uncertainty of the beginning of not knowing where things are headed was fine with me. I don't understand Telugu. Obviously. But sonically, I appreciated the songs a little bit more, I think, than in RRR, even if their placement was a little bit odd.
Yeah. The songs themselves were objectively better.
At least better to me.
The songs themselves were objectively better, yes.
Yeah, so I guess that's where the leash comes from. And I don't know, they didn't feel like they happened all that often. It's really the two.
Yes, I really appreciate that because I'm like, once the war starts, if there's a song, I'm gonna tear my hair off, and that didn't happen. Like they had lit background, like kind of like theme music. Like there's an amazing score behind the actual film, but I did like kind of the score at the end when they're like fighting in the war. I think that kind of takes us to the next.
Yeah, and that's a 2 cents on the.
Yeah. But I feel like all 3 of us gave it 2 cents with like a little caveat, like
always
because I don't want to ding it. I don't want to say like it's the worst thing I've ever seen because it's not. Like 1 cent doesn't make sense here. But there's a critique
absolutely.
To be made, so yeah.
But the third thing that potentially could open up some critique here is that cliffhanger. You mentioned that Rajamouli holds cards close to his chest, and he plays sort of a really big one here at the end. Do you think it plays out well? I guess given how the journey that we've made, and that I also want to put myself in the shoes of somebody who saw this in theaters and then has to wait a year. Like we don't have to wait a year to go watch this. Like, does it do something to you to have that big moment drop literally just a couple minutes before the end of the movie? I'll go to Fahad for this one first.
I will say, speaking of theaters, like a couple of people mentioned this about RR too. Like it was a much different experience in theaters.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like, I could imagine that battle scene being. Imagine watching like Lord of the Rings in the theaters. Like I'm watching it at the crib with like the AC on. The audio isn't even fully like as what it's supposed to be. Like I'm not doing the way it's supposed to be done. But I can imagine it being like an amazing spectacle when you're doing that. Taking it back to like the ending, that's like massive. But I do have a story related to that. My mom is like a massive fan of Baahubali. She watched the shows, she watched the movies on YouTube, and she watches them like on her phone. And me and my mother usually don't talk a lot about
YouTube,
like,
the OG goat.
Yeah,
goat.
I haven't put her onto our channel yet. I don't want her to see me like hitting the pen every like 15 minutes. Yo, what is that? So, but we don't usually talk a lot about film and stuff because our lives don't overlap in terms of the stuff we watch, but this was one of those things. So when I was watching, she obviously heard it because I was watching in mad loud volume. She sat down. I'm like, oh shit, we're about to bond. She sees Katapa's
oh shit, it's bonding season.
She sees Katapa's character right at the start of the film when the girl is like, oh, why don't we get that like good warrior who could save us? And he's like, no, he's just a slave. He's good, but he's still like binded. And then when the moment it cuts to him, Mama's like, oh yeah, that guy betrays him. I'm like, bro, why would you say this?
Oh my god.
Why would you say this to me? And then I had to pause. I'm like, bro, it's like 10 minutes into the movie. It's a 2.5-hour movie. You took away the biggest like twist in the movie. But taking and I'm sure you guys got the unadulterated version.
Why do parents do this though? Like,
I don't know.
Why is that such a mom thing?
My mom's like her, and she was saying way bigger spoilers too that I'll obviously have to take with myself until we watched the second movie.
Oh, did you know XYZ happens in the conclusion?
She's
How
like, oh,
parents
this person,
describe
by
movies.
the way. Oh, by the way, this person is this person. I'm like, bro, there's a whole second movie that you have. My mom's like, oh, I might be explaining the second movie to you. I'm sorry. I'm like, why would you do this? Why would you?
They don't know the difference between premise and plot.
The fact
It's all
that that's his
plot.
aunt, the fact that
All
that's his
plot.
aunt is like a big twist in the story. That his aunt backed him over her
Yeah.
own son. My mom told me that like this at the start. She's like, yeah, like his aunt like saves him. I'm like, bro, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this? But taking all that away, I'm sure you guys will be able to kind of like give a better answer when it comes to that. But I still loved it. I loved it. We were kind of talking about other kind of fantasy movies, not naming any names, where the end is kind of like this magic solution. Boom, things happens, we're all good, hanging with the boys, that type of move. Whereas this movie kind of has that when the second half ends basically and they free him. But I mean, free him where him and Katapa basically meet when he frees his mom. The third end of the movie, like to end that like that is it's such a brave decision because you could see it like horribly backfiring if the second movie is bad. You know for a fact that the second half of the movie is really good, otherwise you're not doing something like that. That's what gives me confidence, and us kind of complaining about the pacing. The way they ended this movie, you know, the second movie is just gonna be like hands. Like there's not gonna be a lot of lollygagging around because now his cousin knows he exists. Everyone knows everyone's around. There's no like hiding anymore. There needs to be actual battles that happen. There will be different things that happen. And you guys kind of mentioned that how this movie doesn't really give you a moral question, but the end of this movie is basically this dude who's now like kissing the feet of this guy saying that he killed his father and his moral kind of dilemma that will be explained in the second movie. And also now you're thinking, will he like betray him again? What's to stop him from like scumming him again, right? So you're kind of finally given a problem that's not like this nameless tribe that just rode up or this horrible cousin that like slaps his mom around for like whatever reason. So I'm a big fan of the ending. I wish more sequel-ish movies would do some things like this. Like you could argue Avengers Endgame gives you is that the first one? Yeah, gives you an ending.
Infinity
like
War.
that.
No,
Infinity War.
Infinity War. Sorry.
Infinity War gives you an ending like that, very much like that, where the villain is not necessarily winning, but you have a very direct incentive to watch the second movie because you're like, where is this going from? And they cut it. Obviously, he didn't make two different movies. He made one movie. He cut it at the perfect time, and I'll like applaud that decision to the end of my days for that. It's a very solid decision. I'm gonna give it a 2 cents if you haven't gotten that from that yet. Sam, what are your thoughts? I know you hate it. Just say it.
Interesting take. So for me, watching the film, as I mentioned, I really enjoyed the second and third acts of the film. I was having a blast, like edge of my seat, like, oh my god, did you, like I was turning to my girlfriend, like, did you see that scene right there? Like that scene was ridiculous crazy, and we could talk about that after this topic. But for me, when I got to the end of the film, I was interested to see how this is gonna wrap because it still felt pretty action packed, and I was like, from when I paused this like 30 minutes ago to pee, I've definitely watched about 30 minutes of content. So where are we gonna land this right now? Like I don't feel like anything is fully resolved. And then when we land on this point that, you know, he's really the narrator of the story, talking about the fact that when I say that, I mean Katapa is the narrator of the story, saying, you know, this is your father, like he was this just king, etc. For the twist to be that he's the one who backstabbed his father, I feel like, and I'm glad, Admir, that you mentioned putting yourself in the shoes of someone who was in the theater at the time watching this film, because again, I have the luxury of sitting on my couch and just playing number two if I was really that invested in knowing immediately right now what has to happen. And if I wanted to get fired from the Ourtwocents podcast by watching the second one ahead of time, I would have gone ahead and done that. But it felt slightly cheap to end it on something that's a plot twist that had no remote setup throughout the entire movie. It's something I've talked about like countless times in this podcast, but for me, I love plot twists, so I'm always signing up for a plot twist by the end of the film, no matter what. Usually, it's an opportunity to kind of, you know, take the audience on a journey where you're setting them up, and then bam, you hit them with this thing that is a different perspective on the same things that you've set up throughout the entire film, but done with a unique twist. I think the best plot twists that are done in film are ones that are, by the end of the film, you're shocked, but then if you were to go back and rewatch the film, you'd be like, oh, I could see this coming now, having known exactly what's happening at the end. There's no way in hell you're going to rewatch this movie and see that happening in the entire process. This guy is set up to be this super loyal man, both loyal to his original peoples and loyal to the people who have enslaved him to a fault. Like, he's unwilling to change that. Maybe you see in slight areas where he's like begging the previous queen to, command him to free her, that kind of a thing. And so for me, for that twist to kind of be fully, entirely unexpected, felt a little bit cheap. As you mentioned, Fahad, it felt like a card up your sleeve that you could just play there for the shock factor at the end of the film. And so for me, if I was watching this live, I would be slightly frustrated that I have to wait a whole year. Again, I would feel very satisfied with this film, and we'll talk about, obviously, how we felt about the film overall. But for me, in a thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyable film, I didn't feel like they needed to land on that uniquely different plot twist where it felt like it was just a big slap in the face. Like, now I have to know what happens next because it's an entirely different story. I'm not super mad at it, but at the end of the day, I felt like it didn't feel like something that was set up properly. It felt like a punchline without the proper setup if this was a joke. And so for me, it's going to be a 1 cent on that, and I'm sure people might disagree with me. People might feel how you felt, Fahad, especially if they've watched number 2, and probably a lot of that payoff then shows up in the next film. But I'm going to have to stick with this one, that it felt too disjointed and too jarring for me to fully enjoy it at the end of the first edition.
Well, can I ask you, is it a question of him cutting it there, or is it a question of that plot twist not being organically sort of massaged into the previous part of the story? Like, for you, is it cut it before that? Like, cut it when the battle ends and the queen decides who's going to be king? Like, is that the moment where you cut it, or is it more about this sort of came from nowhere, period, point blank?
That's a great question. I actually like the concept of cutting it on this super crazy plot twist. That makes me excited for the next film, which is something we talked about that Dune didn't really do. We didn't, at the end of Dune, I don't recall something, making me really itch for the second film. I know I'm going to love it.
He just links that's it. There's no actual thing happening.
Yeah, I just know it'll be enjoyable, but there's nothing that's like, oh my God, I need to know exactly what happens next. I enjoy when movies do that, etc. It felt like this one, to your latter point, just did not have the proper setup to feel not cheap. It just felt like, I could have written anything to the end of the story and it would have made sense, because it's how I ended this film. Whereas if it was something that was properly set up throughout the entire story, which is where I feel that this film is slightly lacking, in contrast to RRR, which I think developed themes throughout the entire film, this film is really lacking in the storytelling perspective, and that's okay. It's really carried by the action, by the overall plot. But from a storytelling perspective, I really would like these themes to be weaved into the story throughout, and not for something to feel like, oh, I just slapped you with this new idea. Now watch the real backstory for that in the second film, when I just convinced you to watch the backstory for something else in this film. It's like where you're taking the idea of hitting people with the ending and then pulling back to how we got here multiple times in the same movie. And I felt like that was something that was so remotely unexpected that he could have done that same plot twist with any character in the film and it would have just felt the exact same way.
Yeah, I was a bit torn on this, TBH. I did appreciate, as you said, there's like an immediate pull to watch this next movie to see the consequences of not necessarily action but of information, which I think is also important, and it sets up a different type of dynamic in the movie. A lot of the times when a movie will end, I feel anyway, at least off the top of my head, like I'm thinking of Avengers Infinity War, when it ends on an action moment, the tension is there, but to some degree you do know where it's going to head eventually. Whereas with this one, it's one of the few moments, as you said, again, you introduce some moral ambiguity. I think Fahad mentioned it. You introduce some moral ambiguity to characters that are pretty straightforward and a story that's very straightforward for the most part. I think you're right thematically. It is quite, not to use the word like super negatively, but basic in that sense. Like it doesn't, and then maybe it's my unawareness of what the story is trying to say in terms of, things maybe culturally that I'm missing, but it's not what RR was, which was stories maybe of brotherhood. It does have some of that, not super, there are stories of the British colonialism angle, of course, and how to revolt appropriately and things like that. This one plays out more so like a straightforward myth, and so the themes are a little bit more surface level, right? And so therefore, when you do end on that cliffhanger being on a bit of information, I was attracted to it because it did pull me into that idea of what's next in the story, not necessarily what's next in the character of Baahubali, let's say. Like, what will he do? Given the characterization that we have, he's not going to retaliate. I don't expect him to retaliate. He'll have that moment of indecision, but I do think there's not enough, again, moral grayness throughout the film to put me in a position to go, oh yeah, this might go one of two ways, right? So I'm going to lean with you, Osama, on this one, and I'm going to go 1 cent because of the one point you made, which is this is a little bit outside of Capata's characterization throughout the majority of the film. Like, he's very much played like a loyal hand without any wavering, right? And so because of that, yes, it helps the surprise that he's the one who did this, but at the same time, a part of me is also going to go, like, I feel like he did it because he had to save somebody else.
Exactly.
Like, he's too clean of a character to have done it because of a bad decision, and so it sort of reduces the moment for me, and we'll see what the second movie is like and sort of what we see unfolded there. But it is a bit of like a gotcha moment that it did catch me. I'm not going to lie. When it happened, I expected it to be fully something very, very basic. But when it was him, I thought, oh shit, what? And then you settled down and you let it simmer, and I heard you guys talk. I was like, oh yeah, that is kind of like, this guy's a clean dude. Like, he's pretty loyal. He's not going to have done this without any good reason. So it does sort of put you in that position of thinking it is a little bit cheap. So I will go 1 cent, but it's not the worst thing in the world. I don't think it wasn't linked enough with the consequences of the battle also, which I think is key. Like, there's a clear break from the previous action that it doesn't tarnish what came before it. It's a little bit of a cheap emotional ploy maybe to set you up to go watch the second movie, which we didn't really, I thought, need, because this first one is enough. There's enough there to, get you jazzed up for the second one. So
it's also more jarring that he is saying that he is the one who betrayed him. It's like, it would be different if he said, if this was spoken again through his perspective, but he said, oh, someone betrayed your father, and that someone is like, even those stories that go like, and that someone was you. Like, you don't know about this, but when you were younger, you betrayed. Like, even that wouldn't have bothered me as much as the fact that, like, you have been the primary storyteller in this film, and now you are positioning yourself as the villain. It's like, it felt like dialogue that wouldn't necessarily be framed the way it is
at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd say something in the beginning,
right?
I thought maybe his adoration of Baahubali would have been a little bit different if there was like a true sense of guilt, like maybe he really did do something wrong. He does revere him, and there is that moment of affection where he takes his sort of foot and places it upon his head. But it's not too dissimilar to what everyone around him feels when they see him, right? So there's not enough distinction there to go, oh, there's an extra bit of like guilt, affection or guilt or whatever the case is to maybe make up for his wrongdoing, right? So so that's really our final 2 cent segment. The last piece here is just an open mic on maybe our favorite scene, something that we want to talk about from the movie. I'll hand it to, I think, Osama, right? Fahad answered that last one, so I'll go to Osama for this one.
Yeah, there are quite a few scenes that stood out to me as the strongest in this film. We talked about like the war scenes and how amazing they were, and I'll let you guys really touch on those as I know you're probably excited to. I will say, in that kind of regard, the landscape, I think, is something we probably wouldn't have touched on in this film, and that is something that was ridiculous in this film. I felt ridiculously good to create the set that's like gigantic, as Fahad tried to say earlier in this podcast, in scale, and it was something truly like just grand to see. It was wild. Obviously, it was mixed with the visual effects that we saw of the different statues, etc. But the grand nature of this this, I guess, like the, what is this place called again? Matismati or
Mahishmati.
yeah, Mahishmati. Was that the kingdom that was enslaving everyone? Oh, yeah, the original. So that to see that the temple and all the different structures erected, etc., was pretty wild to see and really cool. But for me, some of the scenes that really stood out, the best scene of the entire film to me actually came towards the end when Baahubali was fighting Aslam Khan, and he cuts his head off, and we have that silhouette basically. So I think it was cool. That was one of those, again, the action sequences in this film are like really, really good, and that's something that SS Rajamouli really is good at, or whoever the stunt choreographers that he works with are really, really good at, because there's storytelling in all of the action in this film. One of those pieces was the scene where, you know, this chariot is standing in between Baahubali, Katappa, and Aslam, and Baahubali jumps over the chariot as Katappa tries to grab the sword, and in that process he grabs the sheath instead, and Baahubali grabs the sword out of that sheath to then land and slice Aslam's head off. And seeing that from behind in front of a sunset with like a silhouetted background, just seeing Aslam walk those few steps forward with his head chopped off was such a memorable scene, and to me the strongest in the entire film, where I was like, that's actually really, really cool. Something that is probably technically simpler than it looks on screen, but so visually powerful. I thought that is like the sun setting on this entire voyage and fight, but also a really unique way of saying that Katappa kind of like unwillingly helped him in that scenario kill this guy who was super tyrannical, someone who just clearly just exists to be villainous as all hell, and just like was ridiculously disgusting to his mom in that same scene earlier. So it's such a nice emotional payoff for me as an audience member, and that just like is so emblematic of the storytelling and all the action sequences, one of which I think comes in a non-fighting scenario and stood out to me really well was when Baahubali and I am blanking on her name. Avantika, yeah, when they're having their first love song dance, and he's kind of, you know, showing her that there's more beauty behind this like warrior aesthetic that she has, and that she can realize her own beauty through this like song and dance ritual. But the creativity that came about within the jungle, also, first of all, one of the most beautiful settings I've ever seen, like this bed of flowers and this like true Garden of Eden, and it looked all practical. So I was like, this is just ridiculously beautiful to just stare at. But then the creativity that was involved in pulling different things, pushing different things, kind of like fighting, but in a very smooth way, really reminded me of that same scene in Shang-Chi where, you know, there's a flashback and they're kind of like fighting / dancing / falling in love. And this sequence I think was really stood out to me early on. I know the song felt jarring in the middle of the chaos going on in the movie, but the actual movement behind it always, I think in action sequences, having the movement always be motivated by something in the story is what makes these sequences pop out. And in that scene, the storytelling was happening without any words being said outside of the song, of course. And so we got this whole idea of them falling in love and getting married, and, you know, showing each other that there's more than the eye beholds was really interesting. We could talk about the merits of that scene, as I'm sure we should discuss. But to me, just the action sequences as a whole were really good, and those are two of the ones that stood out to me the most. And so, aside from that and the scale and VFX, I think just this entire film sung together cohesively from an action standpoint, and the areas where it didn't do that are where it fell apart, like instances where the action wasn't so packed in, and we had I think he fell in love too much with the slow-mo sequences, where something in a shot should linger a little bit longer, and it probably wasn't planned for ahead of time, so they you know, spread apart the frames, and so you get this kind of choppy slow motion as opposed to smooth slow motion, and it's really jarring in a lot of those scenes. I understand it being used once or twice or a few times to convey that kind of like you stop and notice something that's unique, but it felt like it was overused throughout the entire film, and that's where I would probably ding him on a lot of it.
Can I take that? I'll take it because
Yeah.
I feel I'll mention two scenes, and I'll mention the scene you mentioned, Osama, as being the one scene I really disliked in the movie, and then I'll talk about one that I really loved. So the dance sequence itself on a sort of aesthetic level is absolutely stunning. Like, it's beautiful. The song that they're playing, the colors that they use, as you mentioned, the VFX is set up that playground in which they're dancing. It's almost like a trance, right? There's almost this trance-like element to what's happening, right? And I think from that aspect, it's really beautiful. Where I sort of have a problem with it is the sense that Avantika loses who sort of she is, given what they've told us in the beginning of the movie, right? So we're introduced to her very early on as being this very sort of aggressive warrior type of person, right? And she kicks ass in the beginning, which I thought was really sort of unique. I didn't expect that to be happening right out of the gate, right? Like, she straight up maims a guy, like, in the first sequence.
A whole squad.
So I expect, so I expect her to be sort of at the forefront of sort of the action that we'll see for the majority of the movie, and that's how she's positioned, right? That's later emphasized, in my opinion, when she's given that bracelet and sort of given the task / responsibility of saving Devsena, right? And granted, I guess in the story, she's not meant to be the one to do this. Like, it has to be her son, Devsena's son, Baahubali, who ends up saving her. But at that moment in time, she's the one sort of given this responsibility. And it seems like she's sort of this warrior type of person who's trained her whole life to do this thing that, you know, it hurts her to even be removed for a momentary second from that responsibility, right? So she's cast as this very strong person. That sequence strips her of her sort of warrior personality type. Essentially makeup added to her to make her more pretty, right? And then she's staring at the water, which is meant to be a mirror, and, you know, she's meant to see herself as being the more feminine type. Throughout the process, also, she doesn't necessarily go with it. It is a little bit of a push and pull, what you're saying. Unfortunately, Baahubali doesn't get pulled.
Right.
He's the only one pushing. She's the one who's consistently ceding during that process. When you compare it to Shang-Chi's sequence of the two actors fighting / dancing doesn't necessarily change them. It brings them closer because there's this appreciation for each other's ability to fight, right? And to do it in such a graceful way. And that's what brings them together. Whereas in this one, it's a sort of changing who Avantika is to fit this more feminine side of her that sort of makes this work. This is later sort of, again, in my opinion, sort of drilled when she leaves in her warrior sort of outfit, which is interesting because I thought, okay, so they're bringing her back and she's ambushed, and I'm thinking, okay, she's gonna, you know, take back her warriorness. And she doesn't. She actually doesn't fight in that scene whatsoever. And I made sure to pay really close attention to this. I'm like, all right, is she going to get involved in this? Or is Baahubali just going to be the outright alpha male in this moment? And he is. He absolutely handles everything. And it's sort of, the exclamation point is put on it when he takes the bracelet from her and says, because I'm your husband / partner now, it's my your responsibilities are my responsibilities, but not we're going to do this together. It's I'm going to do this for you. Give me the bracelet. I'm going to go handle this. Now, granted, in the story, he's meant to go rescue his mom. That's perfectly fine. The way you get to that doesn't need to happen at the expense of a character who I thought you've built up as a strong person. And it doesn't matter whether it's a woman or a man. And it's stranger to me that you have the queen lead this entire empire, be a strong woman, and then you do this to Avantika, which for me, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up, and it's a little bit unfortunate that character suffers. And in this movie, at least, I don't know what happens in the second one, she takes an absolute backseat after the first third of the movie. Like, it clearly, her presence does not matter whatsoever. She's not involved in the main fight. She's not involved in rescuing Devsena. She's completely alienated. Does it change in the second movie? I don't know. We'll see what's happening. But my interpretation of that scene was unfortunately a little bit less sort of enthusiastic, even though aesthetically Aesthetically, I think it's really, really good. The scene that I absolutely loved, and I guess there's a lot of scenes that I love, but there's one I want to mention. In the big sort of fight, there's a moment where Bahubali's sort of throwing rocks tactic is kind of not working, right? Because he's just throwing a rock here and there. I always love in these grand scale battles to see cleverness on the side of the military or the general, right? Because winning a fight because you have the better weapons and the more men isn't that interesting to see in a film because it's sort of kind of obvious. That moment of the sheer cleverness to attach that sort of gas-soaked or inflammable pieces of cloth, that he's hurling at these forces and they're causing immense amount of damage. That's the sort of cleverness in a fight scene, in a long battle scene, that I would associate with something like in Game of Thrones. Like, I remember the first season of Game of Thrones. There's something that happens towards the end of the first season when there's a fight happening, and the way it's won isn't by sheer force, but it's won by cleverness. And I think that's what so many people loved about that show for a very long time. So when that moment happens here, or Attack on Titan, right? Like, you can't just win by force, by sheer brutality, right? Because that doesn't show a side of Baahubali that we haven't seen. We know he's a fighter. We know he can beat down people, right? But in that moment, he does something that's extremely clever. And that's something that creates such a depth to his character that shows you, like, he's a thinker. He's not just sort of the traditional, I'm just going to brute force my way out of these holes. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to try to think of what's the best way to do this and minimize conflict. And I think that's the key point, which the Queen brings up, right? He minimizes conflict between his troops and sort of these invading forces because of much of the tactics that he employs. So I love that moment because we've seen grand scale fights so often, and it just becomes harder and harder to introduce elements of uniqueness in these stories and to introduce levels of uniqueness in these characters. And I saw it there, and I went, "Oh,
really cool!"
It got me out of it got me out of my seat, man. I'm like,
so cool. That's
some baller shit, man. Dude just has rock, balls that he's throwing, and he manages to take out whole swaths of this invading army. It was already just by being clever.
It was already cool when the first one went and it was just a cloth stopping them. Then the second one goes. This guy, there's like one singular soldier that cuts through it and gets up. And then smells the cloth and goes, "Oh nah!" And then all the archers pull up with happening. Yeah. That's insane.
You know what's happening. So it was a great moment of characterization in what is like a chaotic space
and a competition.
That was the scene. Yeah, and that was a scene that and it showed the difference right between who he and his brother are.
The other one where he showed that was when the Kalakea army was holding like their slaves kind of hostage, like the women and children, and then he has his guys just like move forward, and you're like, oh, is this guy gonna brute force his way for the competition? Also crazy that these dudes are having a competition like mid the biggest battle of their civilization's entire history, but then just deploys like these. They reminded me of like those little annoying things that you would get when you were a kid, like the little string with the two balls attached to it,
the goggles,
and people I think people like girls used that as like hair ties, but those would always I would flick them and they would hurt my hand like crazy. But then using that to actually get the women and children down on their feet while down on the floor while they charge through and horses maneuver their way through the crowd is kind of wild to see on screen.
Yeah. But those are sort of my sort of, I guess, the one scene I didn't like and the one that really stood out to me as being super unique to the film. Fahad?
Yeah, so for my scene that I didn't like, I definitely hated the kind of marketplace, like just having light-skinned women dance song. Like, I understand it gets eyeballs on the screen. I understand, like, you need to sell tickets. I like, you got to do what you got to do. But what are we saying if like an international audience is watching that? I feel like that doesn't drive the story in any way. If you want to have the song in there, that's fine. That almost feels like kind of plasticky to me. And now that I think about it, that happens a decent amount. Like that happens in KGF too, where it's like
That's a problem with the entire culture, though. Like
but the only thing in
hundreds of
KGF is like
years.
he goes to an actual nightclub, like he's turning up, and then this girl happens to be there. That's also like is a dancer there.
Spoilers.
It's not just like oh no, that's just there's no bigger thing with that. That's my whole point. There's like nothing else happens, so you just have like pretty faces on screen to like sell tickets. I understand that that's something you have to do. I'm sure like that happens in the West too all the time, where people do that to kind of like make bread.
Oh, yeah.
That's
100%.
definitely not a thing that's unique to Indian or Eastern culture, but I'm just not a big fan of that like across the board, not just like in this case. But in terms of like the action sequences, definitely one of my scenes would have been Admir, the one that he kind of talked about. Like that almost reminded me of like some sort of like if Aladdin was like leading a charge into battle, like that's how he would do it. And also like having him be the first one that shoots the fiery arrow, because you don't see the fiery arrows until you see that it's gas. That's when he's like, all right, let me get the and he didn't all of a sudden get like any new skills, at least, because the movie they go through the movie, and even his cousin too. And that was gonna be my other scene that I liked, like where he kind of takes down that bull, where it's not like these dudes clearly have something in their blood that's not like regular people, because they exist around regular people. Like one of the dads is like he has issues, that's why he's seen something as like, oh, but you're a schemer, right? But you see throughout the kind of family and that universe where there's certain characters who have superhuman strength almost, and then you have this sequence of them both having very unique weapons too, which is also super cool, where he's more of like a spear and sword guy, and his cousin uses like the club that like retract, like crazy technologically advanced. I don't know if we
Also,
still have
yeah.
something like that.
Spring-loaded like club.
And then like a chariot with like a crazy technological
A motorized helicopter in the
I'm just like, yo, like I respect the kind of
That's cool.
That's what I meant when I was like brave decisions. Like if you're gonna be crazy, be like so crazy that I'm so amazed. I'm not questioning like, oh, at what time of history is this happening? Where I'm just like, okay, at least he's doing cool shit with it, and he manages to kill. Like he gets an advantage because he has that weapon. When the cousin wins, I wanted the cousin to win. I'm like, this would be such an obvious thing if he just gets to be like the best kid ever, and he takes his head back just because he disrespected his aunt. But I loved that the cousin won. That would have been like my second scene that I really liked in terms of kind of action leading into an actual story driving moment.
Yeah. And he wins it based on his
And
personality.
he wins it.
type
Like
too.
he doesn't win it
Exactly.
because he's like because his cousin is clearly like more ruthless. He would be a more ruthless king. If he
Some
won
Eddie
it.
Guerrero shit.
R.I.P. man.
Last minute pin. Last minute pin. Yeah. Cool. Is that it? Is that any final things you want to say about the movie before we head into scores?
I
here?
loved it. I might fiend.
I had
and
a
watch
blast,
the
man.
second one tonight.
Good
I
time.
don't even know, man.
It was a great watch. It was a very fun watch. So we'll do scores. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. Yeah,
All right, go
yeah.
ahead.
It's.
Go ahead.
Are we
Set the
gonna do this a
tone.
little
Set
bit?
the tone.
I might have the highest. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Go for it.
I really liked it. I thought this movie was very entertaining because, like Admir kind of mentioned, there's multiple times when I was watching this movie, I was like, these things happened in 300, and I didn't think it was too crazy. Why would I think that this is very crazy?
Yeah.
When in 300, the Persian dude pulled up in like some crazy throne, and I was fully willing to believe that actually happened. But why would I not believe that if a Hindu king does that in an Indian universe, you know? So from that kind of perspective, I definitely I almost highered my score than where it initially was. So I'm gonna go with a 8.5. I think I thought it was like really the action saves the movie to an extent where a lot of movies cannot drag themselves back from like the depths of ass to like greatness. Whereas like if this movie kind of falls flat on like these creative decisions that we kind of talked about later in the movie, it's very difficult. Even the little fights, like the Katapa fight where he fights the Afghan prince, when he fights him, like even little things like that throughout the movie keep you like plugged into the movie. So and I'm definitely like a fan of that. I understand like I have to be a little bit lenient because I don't think like every movie should have to talk about something, because I'm constantly in a world where I exist in a space, no matter what I watch, it needs to either align with my views or question my views in some way. I'm not gonna watch, like, I don't watch reality TV. I don't watch anything that I'm like, I know point A to point B without, I'm not even gonna think about it after. But this movie gives me enough.
So you know who's gonna be the Bachelorette. You know what's gonna.
Vice.
Because you can make money off of that if you that nice. Let me know.
See, but that's a different kind of vibe, though. You know, like yeah. But that's why it's like I feel like 8.5 might be a little bit very lenient considering with the other scores.
That's what you got, dog. That's what you got.
And also didn't want to go too crazy. I wanted to leave myself some room for the second movie, so I don't want to go too mad.
Always important.
I mean, you said you were going to be super high on this. I thought you were going to go even higher. So the 8.5, I think, is not that wild of a reaction to this film. So yeah, I'm going to give this one a solid 8.0. I think last week I gave RRR a 9.0, and to me, this film does a lot of the same positives that we saw with RRR when it comes from an action perspective, from an overall plot perspective. It was so ridiculous in nature, which is something that, you know, we typically wouldn't gravitate towards, but I really, really enjoyed it with this film, and I'm looking forward to Baahubali number 2 for that reason. But like I mentioned, from a storytelling perspective, from a motivation perspective, I wasn't really feeling it, and from a pacing perspective in the first third, I wasn't really enjoying those scenes. But because of the fact that it was so action-packed, so just visually stunning, the war sequence being, again, 45 minutes to an hour of just like that final third of the film is beyond crazy. The feats that they were able to accomplish in this film are so crazy that it just brought the entertainment value sky high for me. And so, like you mentioned earlier, Admiral, on the podcast, I was at the edge of my seat and just really enjoying from, I guess, an hour in through to the end of the film. So for those reasons, I'm docking it a few points, but it's still landing on a really, really solid 8.0. And we've been having a little bit of technical difficulties in this recording, so you'll likely be hearing Admir's review now. So we'll probably cut away from that. You'll hear that.
Hello, everyone. This is future Admir joining in, giving his score for Baahubali. I'm going to give the film a solid 8.3. I had such a good time with it. I think even though traditionally I would look for some more substance in movies, I think its lack of themes and perhaps its lack of interesting and morally sort of conflicted characters is a little bit of a negative. But in general, though, I think it provides so much on that surface level of entertainment that it really shines in that respect. It reminds me a lot of how I felt about Top Gun Maverick, wherein that surface level is just shines so well that you sort of, forget in a good way about some of its other missteps. And I think that's fine. Not every movie needs to be a deep character study or deep character arc. I just tend to find them a little bit more interesting, but we do have exceptions, just like this one. So 8.3 for Baahubali, the beginning. And I look forward to the conclusion of this sort of little universe, seeing where the sequel takes the stories of these characters and perhaps introduces some of those themes and character arcs that maybe we're missing in this first one. Yep. So back to the boys in the past.
And we're back. Thank you guys for listening to this week's episode where we reviewed Baahubali 1. We really look forward to reviewing the second installation of this film, probably sometime over the next few weeks when we have a down week with no large film being released. Again, there's a huge thank you for myself, Fahad, and Admir for all of the love that you've shown on our channel over the past week. Again, amassing over 10K views on RRR so far, and it's only been 5 days, and we're seeing a lot of that love on some of our other videos as well. So cannot tell you enough how much we appreciate that, and make sure to keep that love going by hitting the subscribe button, hitting that bell so you can get notifications every time we drop a new video, a new clip on this channel, because we do it for you all. And we look forward to seeing some of your comments down below on what you thought of our review of Baahubali 1. In the meantime, we'll see you all next week, and peace.